All right, all right, all right. Welcome, everybody. Another episode of Legend Sports and Amplify. And we talk baseball, baseball history, Negro League history, card art, whatever is your passion for baseball and baseball history. And I am happy tonight to have on from Michigan, an author of Page Fence Giants, A History of Black Baseball's Pioneering Champions, author Mitch Lutzke. How you doing, man?
Very good, very good. Anytime we can talk baseball and the Page Fence Giants is always a good night.
All right, that sounds a lot like I had Pete Gorton on here. He was my first guest way back in February, talking John Donaldson, and he said that exact same thing. He said anytime we come on and talk baseball and John Donaldson, yeah, so we'll talk some Page Fence Giants, early baseball. Yeah, it's be a lot of fun. And we were talking before we got on here for a few minutes, and why I'm doing these to try to give the context and the backstory and the history behind some of the recent announcements of Major League Baseball and Baseball Reference recognizing finally the Negro Leagues as major leagues. And so, we'll get into that. We'll get into your book and we'll put that up. We'll talk about that. What I do like to hear, though, is why people found this as something that, obviously a lot of hard work to write a book, do the research. What was it? What brought you here? What's your origin story of what got you to where you are today in this whole journey?
Well, I stumbled into this, Phil, writing another book, and
Happens
it
a
has
lot.
led me down the research rabbit hole to produce this book. So, in probably about 8 or 9 years ago, and I'm a local high school history teacher, and I'm on the museum board. I'm now president of our local volunteer small museum here in town, and I had over the years, I taught a class, and we were writing articles. The kids were writing articles for the local paper about history, and I would get people calling me and telling me stories about the town of Williamston, and we're just outside of the capital, Lansing, and
Mm-hmm.
Michigan State University. And people were telling me stories. I would research them, and like half the time they were wrong. Like, this didn't happen. This building wasn't here. And people would yell at me and say I was wrong. And I'm like, no. So I said, well, I'm going to just write a book, local stories. I had it self-published. I'd done an earlier book on a great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War, and it had like 100 sources and 1,800 footnotes. So I was real good at that kind of stuff. But this is just a local book about a Native American chief that lived in the area and the first settlers and a crazy shooting and just kind of hodgepodgey stuff. Well, reading old newspapers, I had discovered in 1895 that baseball was really, really big in the state of Michigan. The Detroit minor league team was reconstituted. They were kind of a big deal, at least they thought they did. And in 1894 and going into 1895, there were a lot of town teams that were traveled. And they
Mm-hmm.
hired ringers and hired guns, so to speak. So you
Mm-hmm.
bet on the teams and a whole bit. Well, Williamston was a small community, and they had a local group of guys that wanted to make money off of baseball. So they came up with the Williamston Baseball Association, the WBBA, and they made some park. I don't know where it is. Nobody seems to know where the stadium with a backstop and charge tickets, and they challenged communities, and they'd come in and play. So there was a town about 10 miles south of us. It's the county seat called Mason, and they were apparently rivals with Williamston. They're now in our athletic conference, but they hadn't been for the last 4 or 5 years. We just never seemed to have interactions with them. But maybe it dates to 1895 because there was this 3-game baseball series that each game got more and more out of control, and letters to the paper and editorials about the worst people on the planet live in the other town. And so I was really intrigued by this. And Mason had written the most per capita drunks, I believe, in the country are found in Williamston, Michigan. Just go to a baseball game and they'll show up. So this was really, really like not good sportsmanship. So I'm humored by this. So I'm going to do a story on a chapter of my book on Williamston about baseball in 1895. And then there was a minor league organization that was set up in Lansing, was one of the teams. Adrian, Michigan,
Mm-hmm.
Port Huron, Owasso, Kalamazoo, and Bay City. So the Williamston Baseball Association says, well, we're going to play these local teams like Mason and Langsburg, but we're going to try to get the Lansing Senators minor league baseball team in. And they did, and they made money. So I found this little clipping. It says, we hope to get the Page Fence Giants. This would be kind of the early summer of 1895. And I played baseball in high school a little bit, and I want to highlight the term little bit. I was on the JVs. I sat the bench. So, but I was a big baseball fan, big Tigers fan. So I wrote on a sticky note, Phil, Page Fence Giants, and I just put a question mark and put it in this whole folder on 1895 baseball.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it came up again, and the local newspaper was saying famous either colored or Negro team or black team. I can't remember the words from 1895. I'm like, oh, I've never heard of these people. I knew that the Negro leagues did not start officially until 1920. Mm-hmm. So I was intrigued by this. So I put on a sticky note. I wrote the chapter in 1895, nothing about the Page Fence Giants. I wrote the book and made some money, and then I set up an endowment fund at our local museum with some of the profits because we need to have a funding source. And I said, I'm not going to write any more books. I've done 2. This was a headache. So I think I was driving my wife nuts being bored early in 2015 in the summer. She says, why don't you write another book? So I went through my files on stuff that was interesting, and there's a sticky note that said Page Fence Giants. And it wasn't even my top 1 or 2 choice, but I was intrigued by it. And so I Googled it, which I tell my students, don't Google and go to Wikipedia, but it's exactly what I did. And I came up with the Page Fence Giants, and there was like 2 paragraphs. That's all I could find, really. And it was the same information repeated, and it said championship Negro baseball team traveled throughout the Midwest and Canada. Saul White, who's in the Baseball Hall of Fame's on the team, the famous Bud Fowler. And I'm like, Saul White, I recognize the name, had no idea who Bud Fowler was. I'm like, why wouldn't I know about a championship baseball team? So I'm a member of SABR, and I've never gone to any of their stuff. I just get their newsletters. And this would be like 2015, 2016 in there. So I went to people in SABR, sight unseen or whatever, on email, and emailed Dr. James Brunson was one, Ray Doswell, who's a curator and assistant at the Negro Baseball Museum, along with Bob Kendrick. I emailed Larry Lester, Leslie Heafy from Kent State Stark, and just said, hey, I'm looking for a book project. I've heard about this team. I'm interested. Is this something that would be interesting for SABR to learn more about? I told him I'd written a couple of books, so I knew what I was doing. Or I thought I knew what I was doing. Okay. And the other thing was, is somebody already doing this? Because I knew there had been no books written on the Page Fence Giants, a few articles here and there, like 4 pages, 6 pages in length. And I did not want to spend time writing a book on a team that everybody had ignored for 125 years to find out somebody was working on this. And I got back emails of very supportive. Yeah, you should do this. People need to do this. This is a team that's been ignored. Please do this. How can we help? Awesome. So I'm like, okay. And that's basically what happened. And that's how I decided to do this. And I knew nothing about barnstorming black baseball teams or barnstorming white baseball teams in the 1800s. I really like this time frame. I like populism. I like the intersection of industry, the Industrial Revolution, and railroads, and times of leisure activity like biking and music and start of movies and such. So this was in my interest level, but I had really no base of knowledge, Phil, on this, and now I know a lot.
Awesome. You touched on a couple things that I've been trying to point out here. Besides putting in front of people the work that many of you and some people, like you mentioned, Phil Dixon and many others that have gone back decades and decades, dedicated their lives to this. And, hats off to these guys, because if those stories weren't being told, who knows what we'd be talking about today, because it was just, that's what kept these going. And the stories are important. But one of the things I've also tried to point out is how black baseball, Negro League baseball, was part of spreading baseball all around the country because there was no radio back in these days didn't exist. I mean you're in the 1800s, but even into the 1900s there was no television. People weren't jetting all over the country. It was a different time period, and you've got to put yourself there in order to understand the mindset and understand what it was like to live back then and what these guys were dealing with. And so one of the things I try to point out is every single little town probably has a footprint somewhere that a team, a player, a barnstorming tour came through your area. So what you just said about your experience of doing a little bit of research about your area and stepping on this is true in a lot of places in this country, for sure.
Yeah, it is. And I teach genealogy in my U.S. history class, and I always hear from high school kids, my family is boring. There's nobody famous. Nobody played pro ball. I don't have any presidents. I'm like, you have fascinating stories in your family. You have to ask questions. Mm-hmm. So I tell them around Thanksgiving, because that's when we do the unit.
You're right.
I say, what you need to do when all the old people are sitting around and the young kids are trying to figure out a way to go play outside or play video games, go sit with the old people and ask them about their wedding. Ask them about the church they went to. Ask them about how did they get to the town they're living in now. They'll tell you this. And so it's interesting because the kids will come back and they'll say, well, how did you find out about this book? And I'm just like, I stumbled upon it doing another project, and this is what I came up with. Mm-hmm. And Phil, you mentioned the context. This book is not a baseball book only. Mm-hmm. I'm a sociology teacher, so I spend pages on Plessy versus Ferguson lawsuit. I talk about the Ku Klux Klan. I talk about having to placate white audiences in areas that were not receptive. And they were the marketing tool for a fence company that was known throughout the world. They sold fence to London, England, and Berlin Zoo in Germany and Australia. And if you're the marketing tool, the Page Fence Company, you can't really ride into town, destroy the local yokels in baseball and say, oh, by the way, will you buy our fence? So they had to navigate these waters. They had to get a feel of the land. Like, if we are rolling the local homies here too much, they're not going to have us back. Mm-hmm. We may have a hard time getting out of town because the Klan is all over. People think the Klan was just in the South. It was not.
That's right.
And so you had to navigate these societal landmines while playing a sport you love, while being a professional, and knowing you were not going to play in the major leagues. Mm-hmm. So this was kind of the peak for you as an African American or a black man, that you're going to get paid pretty good money, but you had to kind of play the game. And you understand Jim Crow laws. And some communities were very receptive to the black ball players, and others were not. And so one criticism I have of the book has come from these hardcore baseball fans who say, I don't have enough statistics. I don't have enough stuff. Well, they played 600 ball games. I bet I've seen 40 box scores. Mm-hmm. I mean, they would go weeks, and you couldn't find stories about them. The local Adrian newspapers in Adrian, Michigan, which they were based, never printed a master schedule in the 4 years they played. So I had to kind of guess where they were going. But what I put in my preface, and I took this as a huge compliment, the first book talk I gave was in Adrian. And a woman who said, I'm not really a sports fan, but I do like the Red Sox. I really didn't know how to take that. I'm like, okay, whatever. But she said, and she was a retired college professor. She said, I love the way you talked about society and you put baseball in the larger context of America and where it fit in. And so I put this, I said, really? She goes, yeah, my favorite sentence of your book was in the preface. I'm like, well, I did a lot of work on the other part, so I hope you read the rest of the book, which she did. But I simply put, game scores and statistics don't tell what you need to know about this team, these men, and the country. Mm-hmm. This book is the story of Adrian's Page Fence Giants, and not a book only geared towards stat heads and baseball nerds. Mm-hmm. So this book was written for the general public. Mm-hmm. There are records in the back that I was able to compile, and some minor league records against white teams that I've borrowed from people. But if you say, I like the 1890s, or I like barnstorming baseball, or just a general history book, this book is going to fit your calling, because it's not just recap of 6 600 games and line scores, because that wouldn't be interesting, I don't think. So I wanted to tell a story of how this team fit in to America in the 1890s.
Absolutely, and I think that's what's important, and when so many aspects of all this that's been missing. You were exactly right. Baseball, especially the stat heads, it is all about the numbers. I mean, look at today.
Yeah.
You're talking about launch angle and exit velocity and crazy stuff that honestly, I'm a big baseball fan. Believe me, I don't know many people that are as big a baseball fan as I am, baseball history. I could care less about launch angle and all this other kind of stuff, you know? I really don't care.
No, I have a son that's into baseball pretty well, then another one who's really into baseball, and he's talking to me about WAR and on base plus slugging and the two WAR, you know, is it Fangraphs WAR, you know, the whole bit. I'm like, dude, like, okay,
it's important.
And so
yes,
I'm kind of, you know, it's not my generation. I don't want to be the old guy, get off my lawn, but I've got kind of a limit of how much numbers can take place. And so this story, like I said, incorporates the men's lives as best I could away from baseball, because so little of the coverage was geared toward this team. So, Phil, I was naive. I thought that if you won the World Negro Baseball Championship in 1896, the Sporting News would have oodles of articles, and there would be stars, and it wasn't the case. And there were a couple of articles every year, and then I went to Adrian, and I thought, well, they must have something in their 3-story museum about it, and they had a file folder with like 6 photocopied pictures and a couple of articles.
It's a shame.
And so that was eye-opener. I thought I was going to walk into a treasure trove of basically untapped resources that have been gathered, and that's not what happened. I ended up reading every Sporting News from about March of 1894 to about June of 1899. Now, back then, the Sporting News were 8 and 10 pages, and I could skim, but I had to read all of the minor league reports from the Midwest, because that's where the Page Fence Giants were traveling and playing, because they didn't print their schedule, and it changed from week to week. Then that wasn't enough for a book, so I went to the a magazine called I think it was Sporting Life. I could index that. They had very little, so I told my wife, I don't think I can get a book out of this that's going to be interesting. So I decided I was going to read every newspaper in Adrian. Adrian had 2 daily newspapers, the Adrian Daily Times and Expositor, and the Adrian Daily Telegram, which became the Evening Telegram. And they were 4 pages and 6 pages. And I read every one from that same time span. And I read church news, I read societies, because I wanted to pick up how much did the community spotlight the black players away from the diamond. So I could kind of weave this tapestry of what was going on. So I knew what church several of the black ball players went to, where they lived, who they boarded with, who worked at the Page Fence factory in the off season. So I read that. I told people I know more gossip about 1890s Adrian people than anybody. Just look out. But that took the Sporting News, Sporting Life, and the Adrian papers took over 400 hours of research and reading. And then I would read the newspapers in places like Manistee, Michigan, Defiance, Ohio, Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'd get them online. I did some travel to Defiance, Ohio, and I would read what they had in the newspaper about 2 weeks before the team appeared and a week after, to see what was the advertising like, how knowledgeable were the ball-playing reporters, what type of team was it going to be, were they going to get ringers, was there racial commentary, positive or negative, about the game, about the players, how were they described, what was the advertising like. So I stopped counting up the hours after I got to 400, because it was just like, because he would say, hey, I don't want to do this anymore, but I did. And so McFarland was my publisher. Here's my book. And I love them. They're a niche marketing. They're really big on baseball, black baseball. So when I talked with them at a Sabre convention on the Jerry Malloy Negro Conference, I told them about this book idea, and they said, we've wanted a book on the Page Fence Giants, blah, blah, blah. So they told me 80,000 words. It's 132,000 words. Thanks for putting that up. And they didn't edit, like they didn't chop anything down. It was, they liked what I did. And I said, look, I want to tell this story. It's been ignored for 125 years. It needs to be out there. And they're like, okay. And they liked it. And they said, do what you need to do. They never said, edit it back. And I heard horror stories from people who wrote books, and even John Steinbeck, who I'm a huge fan of.
Mm-hmm.
I've read his stuff about how the editors in New York would say, get rid of this section. McFarlane said, write it, we love it.
Awesome.
And I also had it, and I want to add that, and I'll take a breath here. As part of my agreement, a verbal agreement with McFarlane, I wanted an African American person to be one of the peer reviewers, because I wanted to make sure that I did not being African American, though growing up in a very interracial community, I grew up with black teachers and administrators, and in every class I ever had from preschool to 12th grade, on my ball teams, on my clubs.
Mm-hmm.
So I was comfortable with that aspect, but I'm not a black person. And I did not want to phrase things that were unintentionally
Mm-hmm.
obtuse, offensive,
Mm-hmm.
word language, awkwardness that would be comfortable maybe in my peer group, but not in an African American or a person of color group. And I got like, this is fine. This is good. And then it was also peer reviewed by somebody else. I don't know who they are because they're anonymous, but that was important to me,
Mm-hmm.
because as a high school history teacher, I really don't want to be talking at people. I kind of want to be talking with them. And if it sounds like I'm preaching the Sermon from the Mount, I think that's kind of standoffish. So when I've had mixed race audiences, when I talk, I'm like, hey, I just want to let you know this is where I'm coming from, but also know I recognize I do have limitations on how I would view things. But the feedback I've received from several African American people have been very positive, and I hit the message right to them. I handled situations that they thought should be handled. So to me, pleasing a group of people that have been ignored and maybe have been preached at by too many people about this is the history of the country. I was as cognizant as I could have been. I hope it's telling a story, because it focuses on the team. It doesn't focus on the white management group. It was actually an interracial group of Bud Fowler, Grant Home Run Johnson, the Taylor brothers, and Len Hawk. I made this is all about the team and their advertisement, what they did. And if I had some stuff going on, tangentially, it was attached, but the team was always the focus. I didn't want to make it sound like it was like an add-on, like here's what was going on in the majority of the country. Oh, here's the team. It's like, no, this is about the team and stuff that they did. So I hope I accomplished that.
Absolutely. I'm with you. I understand the importance of that, and also what you're describing is what I really enjoy in a story, in a book, is telling a story, not just facts and dates. Because when you're dealing with history, many times that's the way it's approached. You have a timeline and dates and facts and history and who did what when, but I like to know, as many people I'm sure do, why did they do that? What other factors were involved in all that? And it provides a lot of context. I had Luke Eplin on here last week, who just wrote that book about the 1948 season with the Cleveland Indians, our team. And that's how he approached it. He took 4 distinct, almost biographies, but he wove them all together into a story. And I think people really, can relate to that more, an everyday life kind of thing. And the other thing I think that's important with all of these is that context of, we all know these guys were not playing in black baseball, in Negro leagues, because they weren't good enough to play in Major League Baseball or in the professional leagues. Just simply the color of their skin, the Jim Crow. You mentioned Plessy. I know that was late 1890s. For people who aren't familiar, it was a Supreme Court decision that basically upheld separate but equal. And so, you can't not talk about those things. They're part of our history.
And I was on a panel on black baseball. It was mostly focused to the Negro Leagues, but they had me on because they wanted me to talk about before the Negro Leagues. And the people went around. There was a question, and I know I might have been the only one that answered this. And they said, what percentage? Because what percentage of the Negro Leagues? We're talking 1920, 1948, 1950s. What percentage of the ball players who were African American would be in the major leagues?
It's a great question, though, right?
And I said half.
That was my guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and here's what I told people. I said,
40% to half, yeah.
yeah, and I said, here's the deal. Now, on some of the teams, the last place African American teams, they may only have one or two, maybe none. But the better teams would have half the roster. So
Mm-hmm.
I said to somebody, think of it this way. If you said the 1927 Yankees, you would say Ruth and Gehrig and nobody else. Well, nobody would say that. They would
No.
start listing other ball players in the 27 Yankees. You
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't say limited to two. So I said, why do we always make it a limit
Mm-hmm.
on the Negro Leagues? Oh, only your top players.
Mm-hmm.
So I said the bottom of the Black League and the bottom of the American White League, those guys would lose jobs.
Exactly.
I mean,
Yes.
so I said some teams would have probably half of the people on the Crawfords or the Grays make the majors, and
Mm-hmm.
some would have one or two. Just like you'd have probably the Yankees would only have maybe a couple of African Americans, but teams like the Browns, they probably have, 7 players or something. And it was interesting to see that because it's always like we have given the benefit of the doubt to the white ball players at this time, but the African American or the Latinos playing overseas in Cuba and Jamaica were like, oh, you just had to be a superstar.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So anybody, I hear where you're coming from on that,
yep,
because you look at today's breakdown, it's almost half today. Now, granted, demographics are different. However, back then, the Negro Leagues, there were Latin players. That's how those players
Yep.
got here through the Caribbean, through that pipeline. So the Negro Leagues were already representing. Look at the Latin connection today. I'm with you. I think it's closer to 40%, or
Yep.
if not better than
Yep.
that. And Gary Gillette, he had, the best response to that I think I just thought it was great because, yes, we talked about this, and that is the question, how many? And we'll never know, unfortunately.
Right.
However, what he said is that, yes, we already know that there is a percentage, whatever that number is, and no one is saying that any of the players that were in Major League Baseball should be taken out of the record book because
Right.
they would not have been there if there was an integrated league. So by the same token, why is there this gnashing of teeth over adding the Negro League statistics? Because fair is fair, right? I mean, many of those players, like you just pointed out, would not be there. The cup of coffee guys for sure are gone. The guys with 100 at bats or less, 20 innings, probably gone. They're the cup of coffee guys, and so forth, all the way down the chain. So I'm with you. I'm with you, man.
That's exactly right, and I don't think people understand. That's why you mentioned Phil context. I bought
It's
a
important.
T209 card of a guy named Lou Krieger. Lou Krieger was out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was probably one of the first all-field and no-hit catchers from the 1890s, 1900s, in the 19 teens. He had like a 17 or 20-year career. He would bat about 180, 210. He started, I think he was like the lead catcher for like 3 or 20 years, but he was that typical catcher you have today. Well, he played in the 1895 Michigan State League with a couple of African-American ball players in the league because the Page Fence Giants ownership starts a black minor league team in Adrian, they start a minor league team that's integrated with black players. The best catcher in the league was Vasco Graham, and Vasco Graham batted like 315 and, of course, never played in the majors. And here's Lou Krieger, who was a very good catcher in the league, but he was not the top one. So I've always kind of followed Lou Krieger because it was like, here was the number 2 catcher in a minor league, and within 2 years he was like in the majors for 20 years. So we already know Vasco Graham could have had the same career but better. So that's kind of my comparison of kind of two people, because Vasco Graham played several years in the minors, and he went back to, I think he lived in the Kansas City area in Missouri. But yeah, you just got to say they did the best with what they had. They maximized the opportunity that was given to them, and then to come back along and go, well, you didn't get to the top league, well, because they couldn't. So you don't just throw it all out and go, this doesn't count.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the people who push back on, it's incomplete, and are we double counting? Are we getting all this? Are they counting games against the local firehouse? No. Seamheads has done a fantastic job of trying to make sure, and Baseball Reference is carrying that as well. But what you mentioned earlier about the sporting news, I can imagine. I've dug through old sporting news in the past. Good luck trying to find anything about black baseball in the Negro Leagues in the sporting news.
Yeah.
So there's a reason why J.G. Taylor Spink is no longer on the Baseball Writers Award, So,
Right.
yeah.
They were very, very anti-integration.
Mm-hmm.
You could say racist if you want. That would probably be accurate as well. They had very little information on the team or any of the black teams other than when they were playing the minor leagues in the preseason or something at the end of the year that didn't compete.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that was my naivete to think that a baseball rag would focus on baseball because, my goodness, they can tell you who was the Texas league champs and the Cotton Belt League and the UP League in Michigan and have box scores. But covering black baseball,
good luck,
teams that were drawing 8,000 to 9,000 people in major cities, that was just a tip of the iceberg. So that was also eye-opening, was humbling, and it made me me understand some of the difficulties that people have.
The keys to the kingdom were being held by guys who were not, to put it as mildly as possible, were not very forthcoming in the way that they were portraying the league, the black baseball players, the league. They certainly weren't promoting it, So yeah, and it's when people talk about what's a good American story, you want to talk about overcoming and persevering. Despite all of everything that was pushed back against them, this is a pretty good one. I mean, it really, really is, So tell us about the Page Fence Giants. I know several of the players. I know Saul White was on the team, Home Run Johnson. Every day I try to put out something on Twitter. We follow each other on Twitter now, but you notice I try to do that. Much of it sometimes is to lead up to what I might be who I might be talking to that week. But every single day I try to do that and I make sure I mention the town or the area that player came from, so people can understand that yes, these guys were everywhere. But so I'm very, very familiar with Home Run Johnson, Grant Home Run Johnson, and Saul White, and several of the other players that were on that team. But take us through the evolution, because this team wasn't just you pointed out that they won, the I guess the quote unquote black championship of America, but this team did some numbers wise. If people are looking for numbers, this team did some spectacular numbers they put up.
They won about 87% of their games. They played minor league teams. They played the Cincinnati Reds twice in 1895 with a weak Page Fence Giants team. The Giants had only practiced for about 10 days, and they cut some players right after the game. They actually were leading the Reds halfway through. Yes, the Reds were a major league team back then. But what happens is in 1894, Adrian, Michigan, which is about 35 miles southwest of Detroit, they were on the railroad since 1844. It was a very progressive community. There were African Americans in the community. I read all the census reports from the time they were around, 1820s when they were known as Logan, 1830s, and then they changed to Adrian. And there were African Americans in all 4 precincts or wards of the town. There was not a black side of town. The kids went to public schools. They graduated together integratedly.
Awesome.
African American kids won awards for academics that were publicized in the paper. The community's main strip of businesses had African American owned and operated businesses. There was an African American gentleman who was a clerk in the courthouse. There was a doctor and a nurse, African American. There was a very progressive or liberal college, Adrian College at the time, whose president came from Oberlin College, which was the first college to open coeducation and black people to college in an integrated setting. And he had come from Oberlin to Adrian. So this was a very inclusive community, and it was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And Laura Haviland, who was a founder of the Underground Railroad in Michigan, who had a $3,000 bounty on her head by the Confederates for running people through the Underground Railroad, lived a few miles outside of Adrian. There's a massive statue downtown to her. So this was a very liberal, progressive community that the blacks and whites were to integrate as well as you could be integrated in the 1890s. In 1894, they had an armory team. They had a National Guard unit, and they thought they were pretty good. And they hired a guy named George Wilson, who was about 18 years old, a black kid from 6 miles down the road in Palmyra, who was a left-hander, kind of pitched with the submarine action. and he was a ringer. And they brought him into town, and they started winning some games, and they played around. Anyway, Adrian says they're the baseball capital of Michigan, even though they had lost 2 out of 3 games to Pontiac, Michigan, and 2 out of 3 games to Monroe, Michigan. They said they're the baseball capital. Well, you bet money on these games, and you kind of, have some fun, and you drink, and you yell, and the whole bit. So they had approached Findlay, Ohio. Findlay, Ohio had this semi-professional team, and I guess I should probably point out, semi-professional today would be like you're getting $20 to play a game in the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, semi-professional basically meant you weren't in the major leagues, but you were doing this professionally the full time. So the Findlay team was integrated with Bud Fowler, who's this tumbleweed in black baseball, who goes all over the place, and Grant Home Run Johnson, who's from Findlay, Ohio. He's the star slugging shortstop. They're on this team. A couple of the pitchers will eventually play in the major leagues. Adrian challenges them. Adrian brags in the newspapers, we're going to kill the Findlay team. The Light Guard Armory team gets beat really badly in 2 games in August of 1894. But Bud Fowler sees several thousand people show up to the 2 games. And Fowler has gone across the country and played on integrated teams and coordinated black touring teams and such. And he gives an interview to the local papers, and he says, in 1895, I'm going to have a all-black traveling team. It's going to be based in Findlay, Ohio, but after what I saw in Adrian this weekend, if you can guarantee me a $500 profit, I will base the team in Adrian, Michigan.
Wow.
Well, the baseball cranks, that's all they needed to hear. In 1 month, they get sponsorship, and they get enough money. And so Bud Fowler moves up there in mid-October of 1894 and starts hiring the best black baseball players he can find. And so Grant Johnson and Bud Fowler are co-owners with 2 white gentlemen, the Taylor brothers, Howard and Rolla Taylor, who are baseball fans from Ohio that own a sporting goods store in Adrian. They grew up in Ohio. And Len Hawk, who's this former mayor, current postmaster. So it's a 5-member ownership group, and they're going to run this team in 1895. Well, the Page Fence Company was a relatively new company. It'd been around less than 10 years, I think, 8 years, and they made wire fencing, not barbed wire fencing, but wire fencing. And they decided that they wanted this black ball team to be their marketing tool. And so they paid for an elaborate train car, leather seats, china, double pane windows, Brussels carpet, private berths, and they outfitted it with a full-time porter, barber, chauffeur was one guy, and a chef. And this is where the players traveled. And the Page Fence Company bought this train, and they used it for all 4 years, and they told the ownership group, we don't want any of the profits. The idea was they had like 7,000 agents around the country. You go to a local hardware store and they would sell your fencing. So the idea was, Phil, that you would ride in the train into this town, the local hardware store, grain elevator, implement dealer would set up a display of the Page fence. The players would play, and there would be singing, and they would cartwheel between, shortstop and third if it got a little dicey. And then they'd say, well, if you think our ball team is really good and high quality, what do you think about the fencing? How high quality do you think the fencing is? So it was this marketing tool.
That is awesome.
And so the Page Fence Company, that's what they did. They bankrolled this team. They traveled to about 11 or 12 states and the provinces of Canada.
We need to bring that
brothers, back. The Taylor brothers and Len Hawk then get baseball fever, and they decide to enter a minor league, the Michigan State League, which lasted 1 year with the Adrian Demons. But they quickly see that the 2 best players are Vasco Graham, the catcher I mentioned, and George Wilson, the pitcher. So they take Wilson off of the Page Fence Giants, and they put him on the Adrian Demons, and he goes 29-4. And Hannes Wagner is a teammate for about 3 weeks with Page Fence Giant with the Adrian Demons. So he plays on an integrated team.
Wow.
So at the end of the season, Wilson and Graham, Wilson goes back on the Giants and plays with them for the next 4 years. And the Demons, they lose money, but the Page Fence Giants win. They win all these games and they make money. So they are run as a team in 1895, 1896, 1897, 1898, and then they're transferred to Chicago for several reasons.
Wow.
So that's how the genesis of this took place.
Wow, we need to bring that back. I mean, I think that'd be kind of fun, wouldn't you? Instead of having teams, we need to have you can hire Aaron Judge to be your
Yeah,
computer chip making company and tour the country.
yeah,
I think that would be awesome. Can you imagine the crowds that would show up? And I think that's kind of what people have to think about. That's what was going on here. These guys were big time entertainment. This is like
yes.
there were no TVs, there's no internet, there was no you didn't
Well,
have your cell
there
phone.
wasn't even movies. I
There,
mean,
nothing.
movies
There was
were
no radio. There was
experimental.
radio was
Yeah.
probably just starting out. I mean, or was it? I don't even think that
No,
was.
no, no.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was nothing, and so when a team like this came to town, that was your show. I mean, that was your. I mean, I know there's probably. I know that the circus goes back to probably the Civil War or around that time. The
Right.
Ringling Brothers traveling the country, but this was. This was entertainment and why people came, and it was, in many places. And I've tried to point this out too. One thing that I think is telling is even through things like the pandemic of 100 years ago, and the Depression, people still paid good money that was hard earned to go and see these guys barnstorming all over the place. And so that tells you that if you're willing to spend the money, it had to be worth it. It had to be worth it. So.
The Page Fence Giants had a contract that they got a guarantee to come to your town, and they got a cut of the receipts. And they said it's like in the years I found the date, it was 25 cents a ticket, and then women and kids could be like 10 or 15 cents. They didn't allow like ladies' days to get in free, which was actually pretty common back then. So these people made money, and there would be communities that were like 800 strong, and they would draw like 2,000 people. I mean, people came from all over. Railroads set up special excursions to go to the neighboring town to see the games. It was a big deal.
It was a big deal. And think about this. Here you are now. We're talking, this is 130 years ago now. And there's the Page Fence Company the name is still circulating around. I mean, who'd have thought? I mean, they probably had no idea that was going to be probably the result.
They ended their run about World War I. J. Wallace Page died, I think, about 1916 or 17. It was sold. It was sold again. It stopped being a fence location on the east side of Adrian in the 1990s. They've actually knocked down some buildings. But there's nobody around that worked for the Page Fence Company. Some of the ball players did, so it made it an integrated setting. Mm-hmm. They were quite proud of the team. There was a chalkboard in the factory that would put the scores up. Mm-hmm. The players got a tour of the factory at the end of the season. They got medallions from the company for free when they won the title in 1896. They were celebrities in town, but it was just a fascinating story. And they were just inducted into the Michigan Baseball Hall of Fame this summer, the Lansing Lugnuts minor league team. And so I went and gave a little speech, and they interviewed me for stuff and put me up on the scoreboard. And
very cool.
I had a replica, and all the players wore Page Fence jerseys from 1895, replicas, and we auctioned them off, and the money went to the Hamtramck Stadium down in Detroit.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. How far are you from that?
About an hour. About an hour from there. I've been down there several times. I'm friends with Gary Gillette. Mm-hmm. We went down there for a black baseball conference a couple of years ago. Turkey Stearns' daughters were there, so I met them and their granddaughter.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. And so this sticky note in a folder has led to, like, I think this, I haven't counted, but this is probably like 50 interviews, book talks, Zoom meetings.
There you go.
Been on national panels, San Francisco Giants pregame show, following Bernie Williams, the Yankee great. It won a Michigan Book Award, so if people want to know the quality. It won the Michigan Book Award by the state of Michigan. Won a Sabre Baseball Robert Peterson Award.
Awesome.
I'm really proud of the book. I really like it still. Yeah, it stands up, and I just really think it's an interesting story
Hmm.
for people to learn about of America. It's a snapshot of
It
America
is.
in the 1890s.
Boy, oh boy, what you said earlier about the fact that the progressiveness of for the time period
Yeah,
of what Adrian in that area was like. Um, hopefully you wish that we can get to that, today. Here it is, we're talking 130 years later. They were already doing it. What happened? Like what's happened? I don't know.
yeah.
But we got to keep telling these stories and getting it in front of people so people can learn because being a history teacher, you cannot learn what to do going forward unless you know the past. I mean, it's your I don't want to say roadmap, but it certainly is a way to know what mistakes to not make, what you can improve. It's important, and that's
Yeah,
why these stories are important.
yeah, I think it's a roadmap. And when I people ask me, well, what you're doing is rather than having like a little tiny spotlight on a certain segment or a certain group of people at a time, you're just opening the lens to
Hmm.
shine on other stories.
Yes.
You're not creating fiction. You're not glorifying something that didn't exist
Hmm.
or docudrama. What you're doing is we're going to take the lens from white American baseball uh, barnstorming, and we're going to open this lens
Hmm.
to show that these ball players knew each other. The
Oh
black ball
yeah,
players knew the white ball players. They knew who the good players were, and vice
they
versa.
all did. Yeah.
Charlie Comiskey wanted to hire George Wilson, the lefty pitcher, but he's
Uh-huh.
like, I'm sorry. They tried this scheme with Charles Grant to make him a Native American chief, and too
That's
many of the
right.
white ball players at spring training said, that guy is not Native. We know who he is because we played against him. So this wasn't like the ball players were off playing by themselves, in this parallel league. They
Hmm.
were playing mostly white teams. They were known ball players.
Hmm.
Um, they would play in exhibition games. So there wasn't like a big secret. People weren't going, who's Bud Fowler? Who's Saul White?
Hmm.
Who's Home Run Johnson? They knew who these ball players were. So that's another thing people think like, oh, this wasn't like on the down low. Like if you're in a town of 500 and 4,000 people are showing up and your local paper's writing blurbs about it, people know about the traveling team. It's just that they didn't get national coverage.
Hmm.
And because, as you mentioned, no radio, no
Hmm.
movies, no videotape, still photography. There's only one picture of them actually playing a game. We don't know what year and where, but there's a picture in my book of
Hmm.
them. That doesn't get passed down. The media was white based, white
Hmm.
male based. So they didn't really focus a lot on if you didn't like sports, you weren't going to have a big sports section. So a lot of the data was never done in the first place. And so you're looking for bits and pieces, some which exist and some don't. So you've got to kind of, go where you can and kind of write the story as it goes. But
Hmm.
it's not like it is today where you've got Gamecast
Oh,
and Baseball Reference and ESPN and
the
every game's
second it
on
happens.
television and they replay it. Yeah, people don't understand. When I was growing up, the Tigers were only on 40 games a year, and they
Hmm.
were almost never when they were home, because the
Hmm.
deal was if you televised a home game, nobody would go.
Hmm.
So, so that was like in the 1970s and
Hmm.
80s, and now
Hmm.
all the games are on television. But back then, you had very little coverage of African American
Hmm.
affairs um, in a positive setting. Every time there was a crime, of course, they would cover that.
Absolutely.
But stuff like awards and sporting events was very, very haphazard.
Hmm. And it's another one of those things that people who push back on this type of context hold up. Well, it's incomplete, and see, there's not a lot of stories, and all the stories that are there are embellished. And well, yeah, that's the whole point. That there was a reason for all of that. You've got to understand what the time period was like, and how things were dealt with and handled, and who was handling it, like you pointed out, in order to understand why there's a limited amount. It's important that people know these stories. So you are a high school history teacher. You're also
Yep.
a sports coach. So do you
Yep.
talk about these types of things, base sports history, this type black baseball history in your classes?
I really didn't. I did a little bit before I started on this book, but my book's for sale in town.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've coached and taught for 30 years. I coach track and field. I have kids in my class who I coach their parents, and taught their parents. The town's about 3,500 people. And then there's like the townships around another 10,000. So I'm pretty well known. People know about this. I show a YouTube clip. I tell kids, if you want to know more about it, fine.
Mm-hmm.
But I also say, I also do this because it allows people to understand that just because you don't know about it doesn't mean it didn't exist or it's not important, because the textbook can only, we don't cover every president. We're not really spending a lot of time on, Benjamin Harrison and, Chester A. Arthur.
Right.
Where, you do Lincoln and you go over Cleveland and Teddy Roosevelt and Frank. And we don't do every battle. We don't do every invention. So I'm like, okay, here's the women's rights. It's not in your book. Here's some baseball. It's not in your book. Here's leisure time. So I try to give, a view, like, what were the average people doing? What were your farmers doing in their leisure time? Okay. They were going to ball games. They were going to the Farmers Grange, Farmers Alliance. They were going to the dance hall, So I try to incorporate that as much as possible. I'm sure some people say, oh, it's too much, just give me facts and dates. But I try to pick and choose and grab stuff so there's like this full cornucopia of what's happening at that time, as opposed to doing legislation, battles, and presidents and just kind of plowing through. That's kind of boring, I think, to most people.
The reason why I ask is because I'm trying to, like I mentioned to you before we even got on here, why I'm using Twitch and why I'm posting it on certain forums, is to try to get this next generation interested in finding out more about these types of stories. I'm gonna have to use that. Can I use that, your sticky note story? Because I think that's cool. It's important. It's a cool story.
Yeah, I'll tell you this, Phil. I had a kid one time. This is before this book, and he was complaining about history was dumb and history was stupid and we don't care. It's old people. And he was a very accomplished athlete. I won't say who it is because somebody local could maybe figure it out. So he was a very accomplished athlete, and he wasn't a senior yet. So I said, hey, what was your record last year? And I said, I don't care. He's like, what? I said, I don't care. And I said, what was your record the year before? And he told me. I said, I don't care. And he's like, Mr. Lutzke, that's kind of rude. Like, you said that to my face. And I said, you just got up and said in class that everything that came before now is unimportant and it doesn't matter and it's dumb and stupid. So if I just ignore your first 2 years of athletic accomplishments, what would you think? And he's like, oh, you got me. Yeah. I get it. You got me now. So that's kind of what I try to do. And most people don't like history until they get older, especially high school kids are like, yeah, I want to be a math science person. So I try to add a lot of stuff that is not from the textbook, but it's aligned with the textbook to say, okay, let's examine this a little bit more. And I hope
the other thing too, I think is cool about some of these issues, and you said this way back in the beginning when we first started, is that you can use sports, and baseball particularly, because it kind of is like tracks along with the country, as a way to approach other issues. Whether they be civil rights issues, voting rights, minority rights, whatever, economics, you can use sports as a window into some of these things, and it maybe is a little less, intrusive that way. People might be more receptive to listen.
Yeah, and it's a good point. You're making lots of good points, Phil. But the other thing is that the baseball integrated before our armed forces. So for people who are not into sports, like they don't get it, they don't follow it, that's totally fine. But they look and go, wow. Why? I said, so if you can pitch and catch and run bases and slide and play a game, why can you not defend the country as an integrated team? So we talk about this. We talk about the Olympics forcing women to, I shouldn't say forcing women. The Olympics were forced to have women run the marathon because they used to only run 800 meters. And so sports said, look, women can do marathons just as men do. Then they backfilled in the 5,000 and the 10,000 meters. So you can use the sports as a social vehicle to move us hopefully forward, not backward, hopefully, but forward. Whatever your definition of forward is, I guess could be different. But it's just not playtime for people. It does have social, economic, political ramifications. that impact us today, whether you know it or not.
Absolutely. And in the case of these athletes that we're talking about, it was a huge impact
Yeah.
financially and economically, both on
Yes.
themselves, their community, and so forth. There weren't a lot of things outside of it. Certainly, as the leagues got more professionalized, and there were efforts in between, but to 1920, these were big. These are big deals, and
Mm-hmm.
and people need to understand the significance of that. So what are you working on next? Anything? What do you got going on now?
I think I'm going to do another local book project. Those are kind of easy to read, and there's not a lot of competition for them. I am kicking around because I do have this niche into baseball. I am kicking around um, an idea. I'm not so sure. I haven't talked to a publisher. I'd probably go to McFarland for this, but I'm looking at what the life was like 100 years ago. And so I'm kind of looking at baseball. In our town, by the way, we had a semi-pro league for about 3 or 4 years, and Charlie Gehringer, who's a
Ah,
great
yeah.
baseball Hall of Famer, is from a town about 12 miles away, and he played in this league while he was in high school. And then there was another guy that Williamston got a ringer, and he played about a half a year in the majors as a pitcher. So I was looking at something like that.
They're out
I'm
there.
kicking around an idea like baseball, booze, and the Klan, America in the 1920s.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but
yeah.
that would be difficult. But that would be something that I could combine history, sports, social, and
Social.
just kind of tell us about what the snapshot of America was like. But it's just I don't even have an outline yet. But that's something. But I think I would do that after I retire from teaching. I got a couple more years probably teaching and coaching. I think I'm going to do the local history book because I
Cool.
can write those in chapters. They're not connected. I just do different,
Hmm.
flood 1975 and
Hmm.
it's this crime case and so on. So I think I'm going to do that. But
Cool.
COVID was hard. Took a lot out of teachers.
Uh-huh.
A lot.
I
That
know.
was hard. So I didn't really do much writing or hardly at all this summer. I do write for Sabre every once in a while. I write for Michigan History Magazine. I've written some articles. I got another one coming up. It was a crime thing. So I dabble in that. So my profession of history is also my hobby, which is kind of cool. So I like that.
Awesome. I hats off to you, man. I mean, being a teacher, especially, I told you my wife's as a teacher, and
Yep.
you guys have been through a lot recently, as of many, people as this has been going on. But yeah,
Yep.
it takes a lot out of you. But hats off to you. This book, Page Fence Giants: A History of Black Baseball's Pioneering Champions. I recommend people check it out and find out more about the early days before the turn of the century, and the impact that these players and teams had on life in Middle America. And hats off to you. Keep it up, man. And down the road, you got something else going on. I'd love to have you back on again.
Oh, I'd love to have you. This has been a blast. Thank you,
All right,
Phil.
man. Thank you. Appreciate your time. You have a good night. Bye bye.